The ancient stones of the secluded mountain monastery stood resolute against the howling wind, their weathered surfaces etched with symbols long forgotten by the world below. Magnus Everett, a scholar of obscure mythologies, trudged up the winding path, his breath misting in the thin air. The weight of anticipation pressed upon him as heavily as the tome in his backpack, a rare text that had led him to this remote sanctuary. As he neared the imposing gates, Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching his approach, judging his worthiness to enter this hallowed ground. Abbot Cyrus, a man whose lined face spoke of decades spent in contemplation, greeted Magnus at the threshold. His keen eyes seemed to pierce through Magnus, as if searching for something hidden within his very soul. "Welcome, seeker," the abbot intoned, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "Few find their way to our doors in these times. What brings you to the monastery of the Slumbering Pantheon?" Magnus produced the ancient tome, its binding crackling as he opened it to reveal pages filled with cryptic diagrams and text. The abbot's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, or was it fear, passing across his face. As Magnus followed Abbot Cyrus through torchlit corridors, the air grew thick with the scent of incense and old parchment. Hooded figures moved silently about their tasks, their faces obscured in shadow. The scholar's excitement mounted with each step, yet a nagging unease began to take root in the pit of his stomach. The walls seemed to whisper, the very stones of the monastery thrumming with an energy that set his nerves on edge. Magnus couldn't help but feel that he had stepped into a world where the veil between the mundane and the divine was gossamer thin. The abbot led Magnus to a cavernous library, its shelves stretching impossibly high, laden with texts that seemed to pulse with forbidden knowledge. "Our order has guarded these tomes for millennia," Cyrus explained, his voice low and reverent. "We are the keepers of secrets that could reshape the world, or unmake it entirely." Magnus's fingers itched to explore the wealth of information surrounding him, but the abbot's next words froze him in place. "The text you bring, it speaks of the ritual of awakening, does it not?" Magnus nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The air in the library seemed to grow heavier, charged with an invisible tension. As night fell, Magnus found himself unable to sleep, the whispers that had teased at the edge of his hearing all day growing louder in the darkness of his Spartan cell. He rose, drawn inexorably back to the library. The moonlight streaming through high windows cast eerie shadows across the rows of books. As Magnus approached the pedestal where his tome rested, he noticed other texts arranged around it in a pattern that tickled at his memory. With trembling hands, he began to arrange the books, following an intuition he couldn't explain. As the last tome slid into place, a low rumble shook the monastery to its foundations. Magnus realized, too late, that he had set something in motion, something that had been waiting, dormant, for eons. The tremors subsided, but the air in the monastery crackled with an otherworldly energy. Magnus stumbled from the library, his heart pounding in his chest. The once silent corridors now echoed with urgent footsteps and hushed, fearful voices. Monks rushed past him, their cowls unable to hide the panic in their eyes. As he rounded a corner, he collided with Abbot Cyrus, whose usual composure had given way to barely contained alarm. "What have you done?" the abbot hissed, gripping Magnus's arm with surprising strength. Before Magnus could respond, a bone-chilling wail pierced the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Cyrus dragged Magnus through a series of hidden passages, descending deeper into the heart of the mountain. The walls here were older, rawer, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. "For centuries we've maintained the balance," Cyrus explained breathlessly as they ran. "The rituals, the prayers, all to keep them dormant." Magnus's mind reeled as he began to grasp the magnitude of his actions. The ancient gods, he realized with growing horror, were not myth, but reality, and he had unknowingly started the process of their awakening. They emerged into a vast underground chamber where dozens of monks were already gathered. At the center stood an enormous stone altar, its surface etched with symbols that matched those in Magnus's tome. Abbot Cyrus addressed the assembled brothers, his voice carrying an authority that belied his earlier panic. "Brothers, the slumbering ones stir. We must enact the rite of suppression." As the monks began to chant in a language Magnus had never heard before, he felt the air grow thick and heavy. Shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to deepen and move of their own accord, and Magnus could have sworn he saw massive inhuman shapes flickering at the edge of his vision. Hours passed as the monks continued their ritual, their voices growing hoarse but never faltering. Magnus, feeling helpless and out of place, could only watch and listen. The chanting seemed to be having an effect. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the strange shadows retreated. Just as hope began to dawn, a novice burst into the chamber, his face ashen. "Abbot!" he cried. "The villagers, they're coming up the mountain!" Cyrus's face fell. "No," he whispered. "The energy we've stirred, they must have felt it in the valley below." Magnus realized with a sinking feeling that their efforts to contain the awakening might have only served to draw more unsuspecting souls into the unfolding catastrophe. As the monks debated what to do about the approaching villagers, Magnus slipped away, driven by a mixture of guilt and a desperate need to understand what he had set in motion. He returned to the library, frantically searching for anything that might help. As he pored over text after text, a pattern began to emerge. References to celestial alignments, to cycles of sleep and awakening that spanned millennia. With growing dread, Magnus realized that what he had started might have been inevitable. Perhaps he was merely the instrument of a cosmic clock that had been ticking down since before humanity's dawn. A sudden commotion from outside pulled him from his research. The villagers had arrived, and with them a new wave of chaos that threatened to tip the already precarious balance. The monastery erupted into chaos as the villagers broke through the ancient doors. Their faces were contorted with a mixture of fear and zealous determination, eyes wild with the influence of forces beyond their comprehension. Magnus found himself caught in the surging tide of bodies, monks and villagers alike pushing and shoving in the narrow corridors. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, the very stones of the monastery humming with an otherworldly resonance. Above the din of shouting and struggle, Magnus heard Abbot Cyrus's voice, strained but commanding. "To the sanctum, we must complete the ritual." Fighting against the crowd, Magnus made his way towards the abbot's voice. He found Cyrus at the entrance to a hidden stairwell, frantically ushering a group of senior monks downward. Their arms were laden with ancient texts and artifacts. "Magnus!" Cyrus called out, grabbing him by the sleeve. "You started this. You must help us finish it." Without waiting for a response, the abbot pulled him into the stairwell, sealing the entrance behind them. As they descended into the darkness, the sounds of chaos above became muffled, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence. They emerged into a chamber unlike anything Magnus had ever seen. It was a perfect sphere carved from living rock, its walls covered in shifting, glowing symbols that seemed to move of their own accord. At the center stood a pillar of pure energy, pulsing with colors that hurt to look at directly. The monks quickly took up positions around the room, beginning a chant that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Abbot Cyrus thrust an ancient tome into Magnus's hands. "Read," he commanded. "Your voice must complete the harmony." Magnus's eyes fell upon the text, the words alien yet somehow familiar. As he began to read, he felt a surge of power course through him, his voice joining the monks in a chorus that seemed to bend reality itself. Time lost all meaning as the ritual progressed. Magnus felt as if he were simultaneously present in the chamber and observing events from a great distance. The pillar of energy grew brighter and more turbulent, and with horror he began to see shapes moving within it, vast, incomprehensible forms that defied the laws of physics and sanity. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and Magnus realized that they weren't just suppressing the awakening gods, they were actively channeling their power. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the chamber. One of the monks had fallen, blood streaming from his eyes and ears. The careful harmony of the ritual faltered. In that moment of disruption, the pillar of energy exploded outward. Magnus was thrown back, his vision filled with impossible colours, and his mind assaulted by glimpses of realities never meant for human comprehension. Through the chaos, he saw Abbot Cyrus standing firm at the centre of the maelstrom, arms outstretched as if to embrace the cosmic forces swirling around him. With a sound that could have been either a laugh or a scream, Cyrus's form began to warp and change. Magnus watched in terror and awe as the abbot's body became a conduit for the awakening gods, his humanity burning away in the face of divine power. As consciousness slipped away from him, Magnus realized that his actions hadn't just completed an ancient ritual, they had transformed Cyrus into something both magnificent and terrible. Magnus awoke to an eerie silence, his head throbbing and his vision blurred. As he struggled to his feet, the events of the ritual came rushing back to him. The spherical chamber was in ruins, its once smooth walls cracked and scorched. Where the pillar of energy had stood, there was now a gaping hole in the floor, descending into unfathomable darkness. The bodies of monks lay scattered about, some stirring weakly, others ominously still. Of Abbot Cyrus there was no sign. Magnus stumbled towards the nearest survivor, helping the dazed monk to his feet. What happened?" the monk croaked, his eyes wild and unfocused. Magnus could only shake his head, words failing him in the face of the cosmic event they had witnessed. As they made their way out of the ruined chamber, Magnus and the surviving monks were met with a monastery transformed. The once orderly corridors were now twisted and warped, as if the very stone had been reshaped by alien geometries. Shadows moved in impossible ways, and whispers in long-dead languages echoed from unseen sources. The villagers who had stormed the monastery were gone, leaving behind only scattered possessions and an oppressive sense of absence. Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that they had been taken or perhaps transmuted by the awakened divine forces. In the main courtyard, they found a small group of monks who had not participated in the ritual. These survivors stared at Magnus and his companions with a mixture of fear and awe. One of them, a young novice named Brother Eli, approached cautiously. "We saw something leave the monastery," he said, his voice trembling. "It looked like Abbot Cyrus, but not. It was heading down the mountain." Magnus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that what had left the monastery was no longer fully human. Cyrus, or whatever he had become, was now a vessel for awakened gods, and Magnus was responsible for unleashing him upon the world. As the day wore on, more survivors emerged from various parts of the monastery. They gathered in the courtyard, looking to Magnus for guidance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, who had inadvertently caused this catastrophe, was now expected to lead. With a heavy heart, Magnus began to organise search parties to look for any remaining survivors and to assess the full extent of the damage. As he worked, he couldn't help but ponder the wider implications of what had occurred. The awakening of the forgotten gods was no longer a mere academic curiosity or a subject of arcane texts. It was a reality that the world would soon have to face, and Magnus knew he would have to play a part in whatever was to come. As night fell, an unnatural stillness settled over the monastery. The search parties had returned, bringing with them a handful of shell-shocked survivors and tales of rooms and corridors that defied the laws of physics. Magnus stood at the gates, looking down at the valley below. In the distance he could see strange lights flickering in the sky and hear the faint echoes of unearthly sounds. The world was changing, reshaped by the cosmic forces he had helped unleash. As he contemplated the enormity of what lay ahead, Magnus felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. He had sought knowledge of the forgotten gods, and now he had it, though at a cost he could never have imagined. With the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, Magnus turned back to the surviving monks. There was much to be done, And the true battle, the struggle to navigate this new reality, was only beginning. In the days that followed, Magnus and the surviving monks worked tirelessly to restore some semblance of order to the transformed monastery. But with each passing hour, it became clearer that their world had irrevocably changed. Strange phenomena continued to manifest. Objects moving of their own accord, glimpses of other realities bleeding through the fabric of their own, and whispers of ancient, forgotten languages carried on the wind. Magnus spent sleepless nights poring over the remaining texts, desperate to understand the full implications of what he had set in motion. It was during one such night that the terrible truth finally dawned on him. The realization hit Magnus with the force of a physical blow. The books he had arranged, the words he had spoken during the ritual, they weren't meant to suppress the awakening of the gods. Instead, they were the final pieces of an intricate, ages-long ritual designed to fully rouse these slumbering entities from their cosmic sleep. The monks' efforts over the centuries, their vigilant guard over the ancient texts, had all been part of a grand design that Magnus had unknowingly completed. He had been the key, the final catalyst needed to bring about a new age of awakened divinity. Horrified by this revelation, Magnus called the remaining monks together. As he explained his discovery, he saw the shock and disbelief on their faces give way to a mix of fear and awe. Brother Eli, the young novice, spoke up, his voice trembling. "But what of Abbot Cyrus? What has he become?" Magnus took a deep breath before answering. "I believe Cyrus has become a vessel, a bridge between our world and the realm of the awakened gods. His transformation was the final step in the ritual, a human anchor for divine power." The implications of this were staggering. Cyrus, or whatever he had become, was now loose in the world, potentially reshaping reality with each step. As if in response to this realization, a tremor shook the monastery. The monks rushed to the windows, gasping at the sight that greeted them. The valley below was transforming before their eyes. Forests grew and withered in moments, mountains rose and fell like waves on an ocean, and the very sky seemed to fracture, revealing glimpses of other worlds beyond. In the midst of this chaos, they saw a figure that could only be the transformed Cyrus, his form shifting and changing as he moved through the landscape, leaving a wake of reality-warping energy behind him. In that moment, Magnus understood that there was no going back, no way to undo what had been done. The age of dormant divinity was over, and a new era of awakened gods had begun, all because of his actions. But as he watched the world remake itself, he also realized that this was not necessarily an end, but a new beginning. The monks turned to him, their eyes filled with questions and hope. Magnus straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon him. "We have witnessed the awakening," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Now we must learn to navigate this new reality. We must become the bridge between the old world and the new, helping humanity adapt to a universe where the gods once again walk among us." As the monks nodded in agreement, Magnus turned his gaze back to the transforming world beyond. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but it was a path they would have to walk. The echo of dormant divinity had become a roar of awakened power, and Magnus knew that his journey, their journey, was only just beginning.